Hello, Biology 1 student. This lesson is on Competency 6, Diversity and Biological Change. I have included the proficient PLDs for informational purposes only. Here you will find your assessment verbs and scientific terms associated with Competency 6. Before we get started, I would like for you to download and complete the Foursquare vocabulary sheet for each assessment or scientific term that is unfamiliar to you. This lesson is designed to review Competency 6 content you learned in your Biology 1 classroom. You will summarize the contributions of scientists whose work led to the development of the theory of evolution. You would explain the role of natural selection and speciation. Evolution is the process of change. In the diagram below, you will see how the horse has changed over time to the present day modern horse that we know now. Let's look at some of the scientists associated with developing the theory of evolution. The first one is Lamarck. Lamarck suggested that organisms could change during their lifetimes by selectively using or not using various parts of their body. He also suggested that individuals could pass these acquired traits on to their offspring, enabling species to change over time. A good example of Lamarck's ideal can be found in the diagram below. If a giraffe stretches its neck to reach vegetation high in trees, eventually his neck will get longer and the giraffe can pass this long neck to his offspring. Thomas Malthus believed that the humans were being born faster than people were dying, causing overcrowding. He reasoned that if a human population grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone. Lyell thought that the geological processes we see in action today must be the same ones that shaped Earth millions of years ago. Wallace proposed a theory of natural selection very similar to Charles Darwin. After exploring the Amazon, Wallace suggested that the Australian marsupials were able to survive while those in Asia were driven to extinction. The term natural selection refers to the process whereby characteristics such as strong legs or protected coloring are maintained and continue in the animal according to their survival value in a particular environment. Darwin is the scientist best known for his theory of evolution. Remember, he collected most of his data from his 5-year voyage of mapping the coastline in South America. As he traveled, Darwin noticed 3 distinctive patterns of biological diversity. He noticed that the species vary globally, he noticed that they were different locally, and he observed species changing over time. This evidence suggests that species are not fixed and they could change by some natural process, and that led him to write and publish a book called The Origin of Species, which is a well-known evolution reference. These diagrams show the path of Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle and some of the finches he observed during his exploration. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Individuals in a population show differences or variations. Variations can be inherited, meaning that they are passed down from parent to offspring. Organisms have more offspring that can survive on available resources. Variations that increase reproductive success will have a greater chance of being passed on than those that do not increase reproductive success. Here's the diagram showing natural selection at work. You see the turtles lay many eggs. Not all of them will survive. Each turtle has a slightly different trait. For example, some turtles can move faster than others. Turtles compete with one another. A faster turtle may escape from a predator. So variations such as speed make some turtles better able to survive in their environment. Only a few turtles survive long enough to reproduce. The offspring may inherit the favorable traits of the parents. In this particular case, if the parents were able to swim faster to get away from predators, they would eventually pass that trait on to their offspring, according to theory of natural selection. Here's another example of natural selection. Here you will find beetles in different colors. Notice that the green beetles are the favorite food for the predator. If the predators eat or consume all of the green beetles, only brown beetles will be left behind. This is natural selection at work. Darwin knew that individuals have natural variation among their heritable traits, and he hypothesized that some of those variants are better suited to life in their environment than others. Any heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment is called an adaptation. There are many types of adaptations. It can be a body structure, or it can be a color, or some physiological function like plants carrying out photosynthesis that will allow the organisms to survive. According to Darwin, differences in adaptations affect an individual's fitness. Fitness describes how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. Individuals with adaptations that are well suited to their environment can survive and reproduce and are said to have high fitness. Here's an example of the finches observed by Darwin on his voyage. Notice the different shaped beak. Darwin proposed that the shape of the beak allowed the finch to adapt to a particular environment. Even though they all started out with the same ancestor, different finches on different islands had different shaped beaks, also supporting Darwin's theory of natural selection. Which finch is better able to crush large seeds that fall to the ground? Let's take a moment to examine the pictures. The narrow beak of the finch on the right would be incapable of crushing large nuts that fall to the ground. So therefore, the finch on the left is better adapted to crush large seeds that fall to the ground because of the size of the beak. Speciation is the formation of a new species. A species is a population whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. When populations become reproductively isolated, they can evolve into two separate species. Reproductive isolation can develop in a variety of ways, including behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. And here you will see a diagram showing speciation at work. Allopatric speciation, as shown in Figure 8, occurs when physical barriers divide one population into two or more populations. Sympatric speciation, Figure B, occurs when a species evolved into a new species without a physical barrier. It can result from parts of the population switching to a new habitat, food source, or other resource. Here are some examples of the different types of speciation. The picture on the left shows allopatric speciation. The Grand Canyon separates a squirrel population that will eventually develop into two different populations. The picture on the right shows sympatric speciation. A population of flies do not mate with each other because they feed on different food sources. Let's look at the mechanism of speciation. Reproductive isolation can result from geographic isolation. This is where the population is separated by barriers such as water, canyons, and mountains. In temporal isolation, the population is separated by time such as day, night, month, or year. Behavioral isolation, the populations are separated by behaviors such as mating calls, physical traits, and mating dances. Here's an example of speciation by geographic isolation. Look at the original beetle population. You see a river that eventually separates the population into two. After many generations, each population evolved genetic differences. After the river dries up, genetic differences prevent interbreeding. Even though there's no longer a physical barrier, they still do not mate with each other. Let's look at speciation by behavioral isolation. Here you will see the western meadowlark bird on the left and the eastern meadowlark bird on the right. They appear to be identical and their ranges overlap, but their song pattern prevent interbreeding. At the bottom you will see another example of behavioral isolation. The horse and donkey mate to produce a mule, and the mule is sterile. That means the mule cannot reproduce. Speciation by temporal isolation. Here you will see the western spotted skunk that breeds in late summer and the eastern spotted skunk that breeds in late winter. So this is an example of breeding at two different times even though they are the same species. Alright, application of speciation through pesticide resistance. By spraying crops with poison to kill insects, to kill insect pests, humans have favored the reproduction of insects with inherited resistance to the poisons over those with no resistance. And in the diagram below, you see the pesticide application applied by humans. The insects become resistant. They're able to survive and reproduce. Therefore, they will end up producing more insects that are resistant to pesticide. Natural selection by mutation. Natural selection is dependent on the existence of mutations in the gene coding of different characteristics of an organism. Most mutations in DNA are spontaneous and random. A small percentage of all mutations will confer a survival advantage on the organism that inherits it. An example of nature selecting a beneficial mutation can be found in Central Africa. 10% of the world's population is infected by malaria. 90% of the cases are in Central Africa. There is a high frequency of an inherent condition known as sickle cell trait in African malaria zones. Homozygous recessive individuals with the genotype AA have resistance to malaria. This is an example of nature selecting a beneficial mutation. Let's look at the evidence for evolution. You have similarities in body structure. You have similarities in DNA, similarities in fossils, and similarities in early development or how the animals look as embryos before they were born. Homologous structures are anatomically similar structures inherited from a common ancestor. Analogous structures are body parts that share a common function but not structure. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors but have lost much or all of their original functions. Here you will find a diagram showing you an example of homologous structures in 4 different organisms. Remember, homologous structures are similar structures that have a common ancestor. These structures are not alike, but they are used for flying. Therefore, they are analogous structures. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors but have lost much of their original function. An example of that is the coccyx bone in humans. It is a vestigial structure because it really does not have a major function compared to the tailbone of other organisms. Another example of a vestigial structure in humans would be the appendix. It is no longer useful in humans. Here you will see DNA evidence, and you can compare the DNA by looking at the nucleotide base differences of the gene. And here you will find the DNA nucleotides of several organisms. Embryology, how the organism looked before birth, or looking at their embryos. And here you will find 6 different organisms. Notice the similarities in the embryos. Here's an example of evolution evidence by fossils. Look at the size of the skull. Let's practice and review. The above chart shows vertebrate embryo development. Which of these would be least related to the others? So we're asking which one does not look like the others. And of course we can say that is simple. We know that one is very different from the others. Which of the following statements describes the process of natural selection? A. Individuals survive that have inherited traits adapted to their environment. B. Farmers select animals with desirable variation for breeding. C. Populations sharing the same gene pool interbreed and create new species. D. New species are formed via genetic engineering. This is a simple recall question, so therefore you should automatically eliminate B, C, and D based on simple recall of the content. A. Individuals survive that had inherited traits adapted to the new environment is the correct answer. Lamarck was an early scientist who studied the development of characteristics in organisms over time. Which of the following choices best describe his views on how organisms changed over time? Remember, Lamarck was the one that studied the giraffes and thought that if a giraffe stretches his neck, eventually his neck will become long and he could pass that trait to his offspring. By reviewing the content, we know that A is the correct answer. In 1800, Charles Lyell emphasized that the human population will outgrow the available food supply. All populations evolve through natural selection. Earth is a few thousand years old. Past geological events must be explained in terms of processes observable today. And that's basic recall from our previous content, so the correct answer is D. Scientists have never seen the ancient horses shown in the diagram. What do you think the main type of evidence scientists use to prepare these diagrams? Scientists probably use fossil bones of ancient horses and compared them to bones of the modern horse. How did the overall body size of the horse change during its evolution? The body size increased over time. The economist Thomas Malthus suggested that in the human population, people die faster than babies are born. Without certain checks on population size, there will soon be insufficient food for the growing human population. In the 1700s, England needed more housing. The majority of a species' offspring die. The correct answer is B. Without certain checks on population size, there will soon be insufficient food for the growing human population. On this particular practice activity, read the description and then identify the type of reproductive isolation. Let's take a moment to do that. All right. The first description describes geographical isolation. The second description describes temporal isolation. And the third description describes behavioral isolation. What is the most probable reason for the increase in percentage of variety A in the population of species shown in the graph above? There is no chance for variety A to mate with variety B. The graph does not indicate that in any way, so we can eliminate A as a choice. Variety A has some adapted advantage that variety B does not have. This describes natural selection. Variety A is less fit to survive than variety B. There is no genetic difference between variety A and variety B. The correct answer is B, because this describes the natural selection process. Describe what is happening in figure 1.3 in the diagram above. Is the population of mice different in figure 3 than in figure 1? Explain. This diagram shows two different colors of mice occupying the same habitat. The white mice can be easily seen by the predators. Therefore, there will be a reduction in the population of white mice. Is the population of mice different in figure 3 than in figure 1? Yes, because most of the white mice have probably been captured by predators. A population of land snails colonized a field of yellow grass. At first, the population contained two types of snail, one with brown bands on their shells and another with yellow bands on their shells, as shown in the figure below. After 10 years, most of the snails had shells with yellow bands. What process most likely led to an increase in the number of snails with yellow bands? Of course, the process of natural selection. What is the most likely reason that there are more yellow band snails present in the grassland? Because the yellow banded snails could easily blend in with the grass and could not be seen by predators, so therefore they could not be captured by predators like the brown banded snails. This led to an increase in the number of yellow banded snails and a decrease in the population of brown banded snails.